Greetings to all of you. My name is Larry Diamond. I am a senior fellow here at the Hoover Institution, but more to the point, for this evening, at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, which is sponsoring a number of events on the crisis in the Middle East. And this one this evening, a webinar entitled, "How Did We Get Here?" A conversation with Raith Al-Omari and Dennis Ross on the crisis in the Middle East. Raith Al-Omari is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Senior Fellow in the Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship within the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's the former executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine. He served as advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during the 1999-2001 permanent status talks, and as director of the International Relations Department in the Office of the Palestinian President and advisor to former Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas. After the breakdown of those Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, he was the lead Palestinian drafter of the Geneva Initiative, an unofficial model peace agreement negotiated between leading Palestinian and Israeli public figures. Mr. Al-Omari is a lawyer by training, a graduate of Georgetown and Oxford universities. Prior to his involvement in the Middle East peace process, he taught international law in Jordan and was active in human rights advocacy. Our other panelist this evening is Ambassador Dennis Ross, who is the counselor and William David Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He also teaches at Georgetown University's Center for Jewish Civilization. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties as the U.S. lead on the peace process in both the George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He also served 2.5 years as special assistant to President Barack Obama and senior National Security Council director for the Central Region. He is the author of numerous books on Middle East diplomacy and world affairs, including most recently with David Makovsky, Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. Finally, moderating our discussion is our own Carlos Kelly McClatchy lecturer in the Department of Communication at Stanford, Janine Zakaria. She has reported on Israel, the Middle East, and U.S. foreign policy for close to 2 decades, including stints as Jerusalem bureau chief for the Washington Post, Washington bureau chief for the Jerusalem Post, chief diplomatic correspondent for Bloomberg News, and Jerusalem correspondent for Reuters. Among the stories she covered from the region were the 1995 assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the 2000 Camp David Peace Summit, and the start of the Arab revolutions in 2011. She appears regularly on cable news shows and radio programs as a Middle East analyst and teaches very popular journalism courses at Stanford. Janine will also tell you all now about some of the other events we're sponsoring at FSI and Stanford on this crisis, and we welcome you to those as well. Thank you all, and over to you, Janine.
Thanks very much, Larry. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, Dennis and Raith, to our virtual Stanford evening. Now, the format tonight will be that I will be in conversation with Dennis and Raith for about 45 to 50 minutes. And along the way, if a question occurs to you, please feel free to add that to the Q&A function, and someone will get those to me for the last half hour. I will be integrating them into our conversation, and I promise to get to as many of those as I can. Before we begin, I just want to frame the discussion a little bit, so we're all sort of on the same page a little bit. October 7th was a cataclysm that shattered Israeli society. More than 1,200 people, mostly civilians, including hundreds of young people at a dance party, were gunned down by thousands of Hamas fighters who infiltrated the border. They went into kibbutzim and towns, and they killed children in front of their parents. They killed parents in front of their children. Women were raped, and people between the ages of 10 months and into their late 80s were abducted. And only now, in the last few days, have we seen a trickle of some of the 240 hostages being released. For context, in the entire nearly 5 years of the Second Palestinian Intifada from 2000 to 2005, there were roughly 1,000 Israelis killed. And now in response, Israel has invaded Gaza from the air and the land, and 1 out of every 2 buildings in the northern part of the Gaza Strip is reportedly destroyed. Gaza City is unrecognizable. Bodies lay in the streets, killed by Israeli airstrikes, and the goal, Israeli officials say, is to dismantle Hamas's military capabilities and make it so the group can no longer rule there. And we will talk at length, I'm sure, with Dennis and Raith about how actually doable that is. Another goal is to rescue the hostages, which we see as being achieved slowly, rather through military means, but through negotiations amid a temporary truce. In fact, CIA Director William Burns was supposed to be here on campus today, and I believe he's now in Qatar trying to work on that. The Palestinian death toll amid this effort has been enormous. The latest number I saw from the Hamas-controlled Gaza Media Office put it at 14,532 people on November 21st. Now, a conversation on how we got here could start at many moments. How do you frame it? Where do you start is a polarizing question. Do you start with the pogroms of Europe in the 1880s that left Jews feeling like they needed to return to their ancient homeland, that assimilating in Europe wasn't going to work? Or the 1948 war that followed Israel's declaration of independence and the creation of the state, otherwise known by the Palestinians as the Nakba, or the catastrophe that displaced hundreds of thousands of people? Perhaps the 1967 Six-Day War and Israel's subsequent occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, or the collapse of the 2000 Camp David Peace Summit and the second bloody intifada that I referenced that followed. Or maybe Ariel Sharon, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip that followed that second intifada in 2005. Or maybe Hamas's victory in the election the year later and its violent overthrow of its Fatah rivals in 2007. This list of historical moments obviously isn't comprehensive, and it's really just my subjective attempt to illustrate the complexity of the question of how we got here. So to get started, maybe Raith and Dennis, we can start on this very question of where do you start with how did we get here? Raith, do you want to begin?
Thank you very much, Janine. Thank you very much, Larry, and everyone for being here. I mean, I actually would start it in the mid-1980s, because in the mid-1980s, this is really when we started seeing the emergence of Hamas and major shifts in the Palestinian national movement. Before 1988, the objective of the PLO, which was the main Palestinian organization, was indistinguishable from Hamas's today. It was to basically destroy Israel, create a Palestinian state throughout historic Palestine, what we used to call from the river to the sea. That in 1988, the PLO shifted and agreed to basically recognize Israel. This led to the Oslo Accords in the early 1990s. In the meantime, Hamas, which is really a rebranding of the Muslim Brotherhood branch within the Palestinian area, was created in that period as well. And since then, really, there was a fight over who represents the Palestinians, who speaks for the Palestinians. One ideology, one camp talks about, and that's the PLO, talks about creating a Palestinian state alongside Israel using diplomacy. Hamas has always been an organization that believed in violence to achieve basically the destruction of Israel. And, you know, Dennis and I recall when we were negotiators, and I'm sure you do, Janine, when you were reporting, that every time we made progress in the negotiations, Hamas would go and blow up something, a bus here, a cafe there, a restaurant there, because from their perspective, violence was always a tool to achieve political means. Fast forward, and I'm sure we're going to go maybe more into the history later, but fast forward, as you said, in 2007, there was a mini civil war. Hamas took over, and then Hamas really started the process of trying to figure out where to go from there. Because part of what they were doing was actually governing Gaza, and that took some shift in the way that they approach things. They have to govern, they have deal with an economy, with services, etc. Yet their core ideology never changed. And we saw from 07 until now a number of rounds of fighting between Hamas and Israel. In the meantime, Hamas has created some sort of a blockade around Gaza. I don't like the word blockade, but it's kind of a closure. And that created a degree of tension. So to me, I would actually start looking at it again from the fight between the PLO and Hamas on the one hand about what is the future of the Palestinians. And then from when the Hamas came in, the argument within Hamas itself, do they remain as a terror organization or do they become a governance organization? What we saw on October 7th, and I will conclude with this, is that, ultimately, it seems to be part of their DNA. Ultimately, terror and using terror and violence for achieving political means won the debate within Hamas. And today, there is no doubt. Anyone who would say that Hamas is both political and terror, I would argue that October 7th laid that much into us.
Okay, I want to come back to that debate that you referenced there within Hamas in a moment. But Dennis, how would you say we got here? What are the moments you look at?
First, I think that Raif's overview is a very good one. There really has been a struggle over what's the identity of the Palestinian National Movement. The PLO was the embodiment of that for a very long time. Ironically, even today, Hamas would like to become part of the PLO, not because it wants to reflect the PLO, but because it wants to take it over. It sees itself as, as a resistance movement, and that's what Raif was getting at. I guess the way I would describe how we got here, beyond understanding who Hamas is to take a step back and look at when Israel withdrew from Gaza. So Israel withdrew 100% from Gaza in September of 2005. The quarantine or the blockade or the closure that Raif referred to, Israel did not impose until June of 2007, when Hamas essentially carried out a coup against the PA, against Fatah within Gaza. So we had a war between Hamas and Israel in 2009, the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. We had a war between them, or at least a conflict between them in 2012. We had a war between them in 2014 that went on for 52 days. We're right at the same amount of time since October 5th right now. Subsequently, there was another one in 2021. For me, what we've seen each time is these conflicts produced a ceasefire. The one in 2014 is most relevant to today in my mind, because then you had, over 52 days, you had a very significant destruction within Gaza. 12,600 buildings were completely destroyed. Another 6,500 had severe damage. Over 150,000 houses, or where people were living, were uninhabitable. There was a kind of consensus within the international community that we should rebuild Gaza. We should create a kind of demilitarization for reconstruction formula. The problem was that Hamas was still in control. And that reconstruction never really took place. So part of the problem, I think, here is when we say, how did we get here? Once Hamas took over Gaza, and Raif is right, it had to wrestle with, did it have governing responsibility, or was it still a resistance movement? And effectively, for a while, it tried to have it both ways. I think you're going to hear from someone tomorrow night who has done very extensive polling there, polling which came out just before, and it was done just before October 7th. And you're going to hear that 2/3 of the Palestinians live in Gaza looked at Hamas as being an authoritarian leadership that was extremely corrupt. When they ran for elections in 2006, they ran on a platform that they were going to deliver good governance. They didn't, because the truth is, at the end of the day, Hamas is a resistance movement, is not really a government. And we got here because, in no small part, Hamas could never give up the idea that it was a resistance movement. It has never been about ending occupation. It has been about ending Israel. And so if you ask me how we got here because ultimately Hamas knew it wasn't great at governing, and to preserve its identity, it had to once again revert to what it is. And here we know they obviously developed a plan for this probably over the last couple of years.
So why do you both think they launched this attack now?
You want me or,
I mean,
Well,
Rafe?
yeah, sorry, Rafe, go ahead.
Well, then partly it is what Dennis just said. I think, look, I mean, if you look at Hamas, I mean, in the last few years, after the Hamas a few years ago kidnapped an Israeli soldier, and then Gilad Shalit, there was a prisoner release. Part of that prisoner release, or prisoner exchange rather, Israel released many Hamas members who were part of the military wing of Hamas. One among them was a guy called Yahya Sinwar, who's now in charge of Gaza and others. And those leaders who come from the military wing, who are now really the primary leaders in Hamas, were never fully comfortable with this balance of being a resistance movement and a governance movement. They felt that governance have basically deprived them of their core identity and what they stood for. So this unease, I think, was part of it. I think part of what they did was basically to get away from this dilemma and to just go back to being a resistance or a terror movement for sure. But there are, I'd say, two other reasons why they did that. One is they look at the Palestinian political scene today, and they look at their main rival, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and its governing body, the Palestinian Authority, and they see them at a very weak moment, very unpopular, very discredited, etc. So I think part of it is seeing this as a moment to basically do something this spectacular and emerge at the end of it as the primary Palestinian address and the primary voice that speak for the Palestinians. I think from their thinking is once the guns go quiet, they will be part of the PLO and they will own the PLO. So that's kind of one other set of considerations. The third set of considerations is actually geostrategic. If you look at developments over the last few years, we're seeing Arab countries moving towards peace with Israel. We saw the Abraham Accords, we saw the Saudi-Israeli talks that were happening just before the October 7th. And I think they saw the trajectory in the region going in a direction that is very disadvantageous for them. So they decided that this will actually, again, shuffle the deck, as it were, and tottle all of these attempts. One thing I would conclude with is all of what I just said is speculation, because Hamas itself actually never said why they did October 7th. Besides, platitudes, liberating Palestine, avenging this, avenging that. So they never articulated it, but I believe that these three components, again, going back to their origins of being a resistance, in my mind, a terror organization, controlling the Palestinian national political scene, and finally reshaping the regional approach, particularly vis-a-vis peace with Israel.
Dennis, yeah.
I very much, I basically have the same view. I would emphasize scuttling the movement of Saudi normalization with Israel, which looked to be gaining quite a bit of momentum, was important to them. Again, Ray said it earlier. Every time in the 1990s when we were making real progress, we'd get a bombing. I mean, I'll go back. You covered the assassination of Rabin. You'll recall one of the striking things about that was Palestinians were in mourning as well over the assassination of Rabin. It struck the Israeli public at a time when they had suffered this unspeakable trauma that actually there really was now a convergence between the two. And there was a sense, I had members of Likud telling me at the time, Shimon Peres would now be able to achieve what Rabin never would have been able to achieve in his life, because he was operating under the mantle of the assassination. The genuine mourning of the Palestinians created a sense of common bond with the Israelis. There was a profound sense, we will actually now conclude this conflict. And lo and behold, we get 4 bombs in 9 days. 2 bombs on successive Sundays on the same bus route in Jerusalem.
18, I remember.
That's right. And then the following Monday, a bomb in Tel Aviv that was on Purim when kids were in their costumes were the victims of it. And suddenly you have this sense in Israel, is this the peace process that Peres is going to deliver us? And this was Hamas. So they seized on a moment when it looked like the prospect of peace was actually quite high, and they acted. I see continuity from the past to today because they saw the momentum building of the Saudis with the Israelis. And by the way, even they understood this. It wasn't just going to be peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel. There was going to be a Palestinian component to it as well. They didn't know what it was going to be, but once again, it would suggest that here you're going to resolve things, and we somehow have to find a way to undermine it. So I feel that the timing of this was driven by that. The deeper meaning, I think, still goes back to they don't do well as a governing body, so they revert to who they are, and B, they did see an opportunity, as Ray said, to seize the mantle of leadership from the Palestinian Authority, which is so weak, so discredited, and to show they could do something that was spectacular. They could hurt the Israelis. No one, the PA doesn't do that. This makes them stand apart. And, you know, whatever the price was they would pay, they would show that they still impose something on Israel. I think all of that helps to account for why we saw what we saw.
Let's talk about they for a minute, because for a long time now, Hamas has, you said, we have our political wing, you know, Ismail Haniyeh and these people in Doha, or, you know, even in the governing in Gaza, when I used to go interview them, when they suit and tie, we're the political wing, right? And then you have Sinwar, who you mentioned, the Yahya Sinwar with the military wing. Is that over now? Do we see now that they are one and the same? What do you think, Rafe?
I don't know if they're one and the same, but I would argue now that the quote unquote, the military wing is completely in charge. You know, I have no doubt someone like Khalid Mishal, who was a very long-standing political leader of Hamas, would still want to benefit, you know, to use this as a way of getting some political benefits and basically joining a more regular diplomatic process, especially in the region. But I think these people right now are very weak within the movement. Today, the ones who are in charge are two individuals, Yahya Sinwar in Gaza. And as I mentioned before, he is a product of the military wing, and his governance in Gaza has given him a lot of power. And there's a new guy who actually, maybe many people are not familiar with the name, but I would keep a close eye on him. His name is Saleh Aruri. Aruri was one of the co-founders of the military wing in the West Bank. Today, he lives in Beirut, in the southern district of Beirut, which is basically the Hezbollah stronghold. And he is now the link to the Iranians. For a while, Hamas and Iran's relations were shattered after the civil war in Syria, but Aruri has rebuilt those. And between Aruri and Sinwar, they are the ones who are completely in charge. Hamas is going to have an internal election, or scheduled to have one, I believe, next year. And the only really two candidates are Sinwar and Aruri. So the others do exist, but the others right now are very, very minor and very irrelevant in the decision making in the movement.
You know,
One of the things that's interesting, can I just add on? One of the things that's interesting is that in the past, we would have said Khalid Mishal, Ismail Haniyeh, that they were really the leaders of Hamas. And what we've seen is they're not. Mm-hmm. They are the ones, by the way, who Qatar is negotiating with, because they're based in Qatar, and they're a channel, but they don't call the shots. It's Sinwar is calling the shots. Aruri, because he's the connection to the Iranians, has, I think, enormous weight and influence as well. But it's Sinwar who's calling the shots. Marwan Issa and Sinwar works closely with Sinwar within Gaza. I mean, there is the Izzadim al-Qassam brigades, the group that were part of that, which includes people like Sinwar. They're the critical actors within Gaza right now.
I want to get to where we are right now with the military campaign, but something you said about the bombings of the 90s, I'm going to jump ahead for a moment to something that's been very relevant on the campuses and across the US. In the 90s, Dennis, when you were running around negotiating, and I was living there, and you had these bus bombings, and Sparrow Pizzeria was blown up, and Cafe Moment, every time at those junctures when you were making progress, I don't remember so many people coming in the streets and celebrating it as legitimate resistance to colonialism and occupation. And so why do you think that we are seeing so many people on campuses responding that way? after such the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, such a violent 1,200 people dead, does it have something to do with just how long the negotiations went on without any resolution? Maybe just speak to this, or am I misremembering from that time?
No, I don't think first, I don't think the issue had the same kind of salience as in this country as it does now. Secondly, I think, look, the Oslo process was supposed to be 5 years, and we're now in the 30th year. Thirdly, I think the Palestinians have done a much better job of telling their own story and highlighting the sense of victimization. Fourthly, I think we've seen a different culture emerge here, especially among progressives that are very focused on the issue of white privilege, on inequality, of oppressor and oppressed. I think all this has acquired a kind of standing in a way that didn't exist in the 1990s. I think the politics were just very different then. And I think the whole notion of intersectionality, the sense of the movement of people who are oppressed and relating it to what exists here. I think it's a very different reality now than we had 30 years ago when Oslo began.
Rafe, do you want to talk about this resistance to settler colonialism, something we're hearing a lot about?
Actually, even before I say that, when you asked the question and when Dennis was speaking, I was actually thinking of something different. I was thinking of how it played out actually in Palestine in the 90s and now. I mean, in the 1990s, when Hamas did what it did, this was absolutely right. People were mourning and people were actually angry at Hamas because at that time they had hope. There was a belief in the 1990s, and it's very hard to convey to people who've come of age really in the 2000s, that in the 1990s, Palestinians believed that the Oslo process was actually going to end up with liberation, with the establishment of a Palestinian state. So Hamas at that point was extremely unpopular, and you can go back and look at the polling, and it's all there. Today, I think the lack of hope is driving many Palestinians to, while again, polling shows that Palestinians today don't believe that terror and violence will actually create liberation. Yet there's a sense of anger, revenge, and venting that is coming out of that. So to my mind, this lack of hope, whether there, and I assume also here, leads to a lot of this. But to the point that you raised in terms of settler colonial and all of these labels, I am very uncomfortable with them for a number of reasons. First of all, I just don't think that it's analytically right. At the end of the day, we're not talking about the French and Algeria when there's a metropole and the metropole sends the colonialists and the settlers. No, I mean, we're talking about a nation, people, the Jewish people, who have a very clear connection to the land. Anyone who's familiar with the Jewish faith or Jewish identity, actually, even for those who are not believers, there's a very strong connection to the land. So to think of it as simply a settler colonial thing simply just obscures this very salient fact. But more important to my mind, actually, ultimately, this whole talk about settler colonialism ultimately is leading, or wants to lead, basically saying Israel is illegitimate and ultimately has to disappear, whether disappear in a binational state setting or something like that. And I find that extremely problematic. Israel is a sovereign state. One of the key components and one of the key pillars of the international order, as we understand it, is the preservation of sovereignty and the inviolability of the sovereignty. So any narrative that ultimately seeks to lead to the destruction, elimination of an existing nation state, I find it extremely problematic, both politically, legally, and frankly, morally.
So
can I just add to,
yes,
because I think the point's a very important one. The people who say a colonial settler state, they seem to be unaware that there is a historic Jewish connection to the land. There was always at least a small Jewish connection there after the diaspora, after the dispersal. But in terms of the Jewish people, there was always an identity and a connection, a historic connection to the land. The key prayers for Rosh Hashanah, you prayed for next year in Jerusalem. At Passover, at the end of the Seder, you prayed for next year in Jerusalem. So there was always this deep historic connection to land, number one. Number two, this was not an empire that was then going and colonizing other places. The people who were going there, you made a reference, I think, to the pogroms. People went there because, in a sense, they were persecuted. So these were not people who were seeking to expand to new lands. These were people who had, in a sense, very few options and were persecuted. Thirdly, more than half of the population in Israel today is made up of people Jews from the Arab world, who were forced out with nothing from their homes. They were forced to leave with none of their possessions, none of their wealth, and they were forced to leave overnight. And they went to Israel because there was no place else for them. So when I hear people use these terms, it's so divorced from the reality that it's a slogan that seems to satisfy a certain need, but it doesn't fit what the reality is.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to go now to where we're at. And Dennis, you wrote, I think it was in the Washington Post on October 27th.
The New York Times.
Sorry, the New York Times. I'm partial to In the past, I might have favored a ceasefire with Hamas during a conflict with Israel, but today it's clear to me that peace is not going to be possible now or in the future, as long as Hamas remains intact and in control of Gaza. So we're 4 or 5 days into a temporary day-to-day truce, allowing for the release of hostages in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners. Do you still feel this way?
I do, because I think if this ends and Hamas is still in control in Gaza, they will do what they did before. Well, we've had 4 ceasefires before. I was citing before 2014, which went on for 52 days with very extensive destruction. The effort by the international community to try to do reconstruction failed because there was no ability to prevent Hamas from diverting materials. We know they diverted massive materials because they built an underground city with tunnels, which, by the way, Palestinian, the public in Gaza can't go into the tunnels. It's only for the fighters and for the leaders and for their weapons. They have a credo, they have an ideology, they have a mission. And as I said, it's not about coexistence, it's about rejection. It's not about occupation, it's about no Israel. So if they still control Gaza, and if the images that they won, then their ideology of rejection will also win, and it will have an appeal, and it will appeal to other Palestinians. Say, okay, look, there was a price to be paid, but look at the success they had. And other Arab leaders will feel, again, more defensive because they'll see the potential attraction of their publics to this. So I see this as guaranteeing we will face this again. It will guarantee that in Israel, there is going to be a political reckoning after what happened on October 7th. We're going to see a different political reality in Israel. It'll take some time to play out, but it will take place. And there'll be a debate for the first time of what the relationship with the Palestinians should be. Now, if in fact Hamas is still in control in Gaza, and it wasn't just the massacre, it was atrocities. You referred to the rapes. We have them amputating limbs of kids in front of their parents, and then killing them. We see them celebrating torture. So you're Israelis, and this is what is living next to you. The walls will be higher than ever under those circumstances. There'll be no prospect of producing any peace. So yes, from my standpoint, there has to be a way to end the control of Hamas in Gaza. When I say that, it doesn't mean annihilating Hamas or eradicating Hamas, because first, Hamas is an organization that exists not only in Gaza. Second, you can defeat it militarily. You can destroy its military wherewithal. You can destroy. They built up a military industrial base. They didn't build Gaza up. They left it impoverished. They didn't just build tunnels. They produced their own drones. They produced their own mortars. They produced their own rockets. They got help to do all this from Iran and from Hezbollah, but they created that base. Now the Israelis are in the process of destroying that. And if the military wherewithal, the military industrial base, the infrastructure, the command control, if all that is destroyed. You'll still have people who identify with Hamas in Gaza, but they will be weak to the point where you could create a transitional regime under an international umbrella. I would like to see it run by Palestinian technocrats. I'd like to see a security force that would be made up of those from the region outside. And I would like there to be a transition period of 18 to 24 months. And eventually, you use that period also to revitalize the PA. Arabs, I will tell you from my own trips now to the region since this began, you have Arabs who are focused more on having to address the issue of the Palestinians the way they were not. And they're also prepared to invest in reconstruction in Gaza, and they're prepared to invest in a revitalization and reform of the PA, so long as it's part of a broader approach that has a political horizon and a political destination. That part won't be easy for Israel until you've had this reckoning within Israel. But this catastrophe for the Israelis, but now also for the Palestinians in Gaza, and it is catastrophic. Out of this, something needs to happen that is for the better. To experience something like this and then to act as if, well, we're going back to October 6th, it won't work with the Israelis, and it's not going to work in the region.
Yeah. Rafe, do you want to add to that? And maybe when you add to it, you can talk about Mahmoud and Abbas in all of this, right? He's, what is he, 86 now, 87?
87.
87.
88. Who can keep up?
88. He hasn't been in good health for a very long time. And the narrative has been that Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, this has actually worked for him to keep, him in the West Bank and keep Hamas in control in Gaza. And then he doesn't have to worry about these peace deals and political horizons that Dennis is fond of, right? I mean, so talk about how the Palestinians are, how do you think about what Dennis said, and how does Abbas think about this?
Look, I mean, first of all, let me start with kind of the whole ceasefire question. And here again, I mean, I have to go back one step and say October 7th was a qualitatively different incident than anything we've had in the past, in at least since the 1990s, probably even before that. And so the day after will actually also have to be very different. If Hamas emerges from this conflict with the ability to say that we won, then they have reshaped the Palestinian political system completely. They will emerge completely in charge. And this is not something that is good, I believe, for the Palestinians or for the Israelis. And as Dennis said, the message it will send to other terrorist organizations and to Iran and its proxies is you can do something like this and you can get away with it and you will emerge stronger. So I think this is, in policy terms, a much bigger deal than anything that we have seen so far, at least since my involvement in this conflict. Yet, honestly, at the end of the day, what I think or what Dennis think is irrelevant, because today we see a situation where Israel actually, the world understands that Israel has the right to defend itself. And so far, we actually see an international coalition that supports Israel, gives it the diplomatic cover to achieve this objective. However, and this is why we have not seen a ceasefire yet. However, this is fraying, and it will only hold if Israel can show and demonstrate that it's taking enough care to minimize civilian casualties and is doing everything possible to allow for the humanitarian aid, etc., to come in. Part of that, irrespective of what we think of a ceasefire, it will be inevitable. So if Israel wants to continue to pursue the objective, it has to really be more mindful about this civilian casualties and the humanitarian situation. Look, when it comes to Abbas, he is irrelevant. I mean, this is the most polite word that I can say. I mean, sometimes we know, for example, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is going to be there next week. He's going to go and see Abbas. Arab leaders want to go and meet with Abbas, but they only do that to signal that they still consider the Palestinian Authority to be the legitimate address. But no one actually believes today that Abbas is up to the task. When I've spoken to Arab officials recently, that sentiment is very much within Arab officialdom, from the Gulf to the Levant and elsewhere. But it goes deeper than Mahmoud Abbas himself. Again, the Palestinian Authority as a body, as a project, today is extremely discredited. And it's discredited really I would say for three reasons. One, which is obvious, it failed in its core mission, the promise to liberate Palestine through diplomacy. Simply failed. And so the public is questioning that. But also the corruption, poor governance, etc., of the Palestinian Authority has led to its discrediting. These are the same factors that ultimately led to the Arab Spring. And finally, under Abbas in particular, the closing of the political space and the lack of a place for young Palestinian, politically minded Palestinians to exercise their energies have really made the PA irrelevant. So as we look at what comes after, I believe there is no way that Abbas can politically survive this. He's become more of a liability. We do need, as we look at the day after, not to only focus on building Gaza, and that is key and of course has to be done, but also on rebuilding the Palestinian Authority, re-engaging in a reform process that would create strong institutions, ones that the Palestinians can respect, but ones that the world can look at and say, you know what, those guys can run a state. Short of that, you know, Hamas can emerge battered, but if the alternative is so discredited, then Hamas will remain the only actor. The one, and I will conclude maybe with a point of maybe good news, is that it's not such a tall order. When George W. Bush decided that the issue of Palestinian reform was a priority, it was amazing how, you know, he built a coalition, European Arab coalition, that went to the Palestinians and say that you either reform or you don't get financial or diplomatic support. And the Palestinians had to reform. They picked up a prime minister, a reformist prime minister. His name was
They had
Salam
Salam
Fayyad.
Fayyad. They had Salam Fayyad. They were going to do
Exactly.
currency.
In
And all the
3
U.S.
years,
forces training the
yeah,
PA. Like it was
yeah.
a heyday. But right now, are you concerned that Hamas is looking really popular right now, and they're
Totally.
released, the prisoners are coming out, and I mean, and you're saying that no one likes Abbas either. So who is going to be this new Salam Fayyad, new figure? As
Hey,
one of
look,
the
I'm
questions
not.
in the chat, actually, too.
I mean, it's actually, I wouldn't go into the name game right now. And, you know, when Fayyad was picked as a finance minister, no one knew who Fayyad was. You know, I worked in the Palestinian Authority long enough to know that there are a lot of talented and capable people. Give them the space and create an international kind of architecture that rewards let's say, clean governance, rewards strong and clear and open institutions, and is serious about fighting corruption, etc., you will find plenty of capable people who can do that. I am less worried about that. What I'm more worried about is having the international diplomatic will to actually do something like this, because this is not easy. You will have to go to the Palestinian Authority, to Abbas, and basically say, you need to step aside. And that's never an easy thing for any outside force to do. Once though that this is done, I believe that the Palestinians can produce their own leaders, and I believe at the same time that the Palestinian public, you know, with the limited success that Fayyad created, his popularity was actually rising until the world abandoned that project, and ultimately Abbas and others came and kicked him out. I would add one more thing though, is that it's not only about reform and governance, and even though this is essential, and this is something the Palestinians have to do for themselves, Israel has to do its part as well, because Israel has to demonstrate to Palestinians that taking a peaceful, cooperative approach is one that is rewarded, which really goes to your point. I mean, Bibi, Benjamin Netanyahu, has basically been keeping the Palestinian Authority on life support, actually trying to cast it as a terror supporting entity, but also allowing Hamas to exist, and I would even say to thrive to a point. He worked with the Qataris to bring in monthly amounts of money, etc. So I think the Israelis also have to make up their minds. And this is, again, the reckoning that Dennis was talking about. Israel will not look the same politically after this. And the Israelis will have to figure out, do you want to start trying to rebuild a partner on the Palestinian side? It will take time, and the trauma on both societies will take a long time to heal, but it's a path that can be taken. Or is the path going to be the same path as Netanyahu, which is basically keep them divided so that we don't have to deal with the issue of the Palestinian state and a two-state solution, etc. So yes, the Palestinians have their own homework to do, and a lot of it, but also the Israelis have to decide which path they're going to take.
I want to come to the Israelis and the right-wing Prime Minister Netanyahu. Dennis, I don't want to miss the opportunity. I feel like there's a country that is not being mentioned enough in all these discussions, and it's Egypt on many levels. One, it's not only Israel that's maintained the blockade. I'm enumerating like you, Dennis, right? One, it's not just Israel, it's Egypt. And when you tell the Palestinians to move to the south, right, they're stuck there in that Rafah crossing area, and Egypt's like, no, no. Right, I know they don't want to have a refugee crisis like Jordan has with the Syrians, and I know all these things, but do we not have any leverage over the United States, that is, over Egypt, to at least let some more people come out that way to allow this military operation to cause less casualties? Dennis?
Yeah, look, it's a complicated question.
Oh, your favorite. It's complicated.
Yes, and but look, we have to think about the difference between the Middle East and every place else in the world. And here I think I want to zero in even more than what I just said. Look at Syria during the war in Syria. 6 million people became refugees. 3.5 million, I mean, just in the surrounding area. 3.5 million in Turkey. More than 1 million in Lebanon. Probably a comparable number, close to a comparable number in Jordan. And then the rest off in Europe. They left. Here, there's no readiness to allow Palestinians to leave because it's part of the narrative that the Palestinians suffered one displacement, the Nakba, back in 48. They're not going to allow another Nakba, and Egypt and Jordan are not going to be host to this. It's part of the psychology of the conflict that separates it. This has been an existential conflict between two national identities, two national movements competing for the same space. And there are those in the Arab world who will look at the Israelis, oh, they're going to try to solve the Palestinian problem by displacing them again. And so Egypt is not going to play the part of taking Palestinians because they're not going to contribute to that imagery. You're making the point, well, look, couldn't they take them on a temporary basis? And part of the concern is it won't be temporary. The Egyptians themselves have a concern that the Palestinians who would leave Gaza will never leave Egypt. And so part of it's tied up with this sort of historical narrative. Part of it is tied up with the practicalities of actually absorbing Palestinians. It's just different than we've seen in other conflicts. Egypt, I will say, to be fair to Egypt, they are, the assistance is coming through, humanitarian assistance is coming through Rafah. Ray said earlier, and I want to reinforce it, when I don't favor a ceasefire, it doesn't mean I favor the situation as it is. There has to be a dramatically better job of providing humanitarian assistance. And one of the things that would make it dramatically better is if the Israelis would allow Kerem Shalom to be used. Kerem Shalom has all of the modern scanning capabilities that allow you to process trucks much more rapidly. Rafah does not have that. Right now, because of the pause, there's 200 trucks a day going in with humanitarian assistance. If you could use Kerem Shalom, you could easily go up to 600 trucks a day. If you had 600 trucks a day at a time when you have 2 million Palestinians now living in the southern part of Gaza, you can address what their needs are going to be. That, if you're going to relieve some of the pressure and give the Israelis the time and space they need to affect the political objectives that the military objectives they've identified, then they have to do a dramatically better job of allowing humanitarian assistance to go in.
But Dennis, they're going to start bombing the South next. That's where the Hamas terrorists,
right?
Everybody is. So where do you send all the aid?
But I suspect they're going to have to conduct the military operation differently than they did in the north.
Okay. So
and in part because you also have 2 million people down there. They will end up having to create new safe areas. They will have to create safe corridors. They will have to do that. Look, they asked for people to leave the north to go to the south. That's what they were asking. They've moved them, people have moved. 2 million people are now in the south. Is that out of a population of 2.3 million? 2 million people are now in the south. So Israel, as it conducts this military operation, has to take that into account. People moved where they asked them to move, and they have to be safe, and then they have to be sustained when they're there.
let's talk about Israel and Netanyahu right now. You have the most right-wing government that you've ever seen, Dennis. Can we just set that at the outset?
Not even a close,
Not even
not even a
close.
close call. Not even
Not
a
even
close call.
close. So now we're dealing with this, you know, people like Itamar Ben-Gvir. You've had 7 months of Israelis protesting Netanyahu before this even began. There's a cynical view that he wants to, this will go on as long as he doesn't want the war to end, because then he knows he's going to be thrown out of office and then maybe be indicted and go to, you know, let's just set that aside for a moment. When you're looking at the Israeli population and they see what happened on October 7th, what you worked on for your whole career was we're going to trade land for peace, right? And then you got out of Gaza. Ariel Sharon gets out of Gaza, albeit not in the context of a peace agreement. And that territory was used to launch the deadliest attack on civilians in its country's history. How on earth do you ever get the Israeli population and this most right-wing government to do any kind of process again? Like, and I know you always used to say we need the process, and we haven't had that in a long time. So how do you even, is it gonna, in our lifetime, how does that even happen now?
Look, you're going to have a debate in Israel. It won't just be a political reckoning. You will end up having a political debate, as I said earlier, on what the relationship with Palestinians will need to be. There will be one side that's going to make the argument, you see what Hamas did? If we have a state, okay, you defeated Hamas, but if we have a state, you'll have a group like Hamas will take over that state, and it will be a mortal threat to us. We can't possibly have the state. The other part of the argument, the other side is going to say, okay, we just defeated Hamas. You think we can sustain occupation forever and Palestinians will simply be quiescent and accept it? No, they will become radicalized. If they don't have a state, they have no prospect, no hope. We will face a successor to Hamas. You who guaranteed that nothing could be done are the ones who helped produce this in the first place, not because you created Hamas, because Hamas basically is indigenous to the Palestinians. But you basically put us in a position where Palestinians had no hope, no possibility, no prospect, and that is bound to create a radicalized public. So you're going to have, that's going to be the debate. At the end of the day, my sense is those who understand that you can't control the Palestinians forever and expect them simply to accept it, that they will emerge in this debate. The challenge for us is to buy the time to allow them to have that debate. We have two kinds of, we have different timelines right now, and they don't mesh. You know, you have a timeline where the key Arab states are prepared to do something on the Palestinian issue, frankly, they've never done before, because they realize they're going to have to do something. And it means that you have a process, a sequence of steps, rebuilding Gaza, rebuilding and overhauling the Palestinian Authority, and then having a political approach that offers you a horizon and a political destination. That destination is something the Arabs want to talk about to begin the first step of reconstruction. And the Israelis, it's too soon for them to do it. They're still processing the trauma. They haven't had their debate yet. So we have to come up with a way, and I think it has to be the United States, because I don't see anybody else doing it, but they have to do it, I think, with the Arabs. We have to come up with a way that creates a bridge between these two kinds of timelines. We reconcile the conflicting timelines. So we talk about two states, which the Biden administration is doing. I would do something else. I would have a new sort of capstone, which is end the occupation consistent with Israel's security needs. The imagery of occupation is something that the Arabs can relate to, that's what has to end. But the Israelis have to know that occupation can't end and leave them vulnerable. So these are two sides of the same coin.
You always try to negotiate, just for the audience, people, the four main issues, right? The future of Jerusalem, settlements and territory and borders, security, and the right of return, right? So,
well, the refugees, the issue of refugees.
The issue of the refugees, right? And for you, looking back now, and Raith too, as a negotiator, which of those was the main sticking point? And then how in this new, much more complicated situation do we move on any of them?
Look, I will tell you that the main sticking points were what I call the narrative issues, Jerusalem and refugees. The issue of security, I don't mean to minimize security and territory, but the truth is those are technical issues. And Raith knows, if you give the two of us a room to go sit in, we can figure out any of the technical issues. All right, there's always an answer for the technical issues. The narrative issues are the hard ones, because the narrative issues, you're asking both sides to take on history and mythology. That's profoundly difficult. It takes leaders who are prepared, it takes leaders who are legitimate and who are seen by their publics as being legitimate and having legitimacy. It takes leaders to have that legitimacy on the one hand and be determined to say, okay, you know what? It's time we end this conflict. And I'm going to have to take steps that are going to produce a terrible backlash against me. We haven't had the leaders to do that. And we weren't able to create the context to do this. And to be honest, we didn't do some of the things we should have done. We, the US, we should have basically said, you know, before we go to a summit like Camp David, we want each side, we want the two leaders to prove to us that they will say things in public that will make it clear they're prepared to make the hard decisions. If you go to a leader and say, are you prepared to make the big decisions? They always say yes. It means nothing. The only thing that means something is when you get them to say, you know, if in 2014, I'll give you an example. When the Kerry process ended up collapsing, I said to him, because I had been doing a back channel and he used the product
Just
of
for the
that back
audience,
channel.
when President Obama sent Secretary Kerry and he was running back and forth in the snow between Jerusalem and Abbas, right?
So when it was collapsing, I said to him, look, why don't you go to Bibi and Abu Mazen and say, you know what, I'm prepared to do everything I can to help resolve this conflict and end it. I need you, Prime Minister Netanyahu, to declare that you will build no settlements, you'll freeze settlement building to the east of the security barrier. And I need you, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, I need you to acknowledge there's a historic Jewish connection to the land. Now, for each of them to say that was going to produce a backlash. Their readiness to say it was proof positive, okay, we're ready to go down this road. In truth, neither one of them would have said it. And so your point then was, okay, we can't solve the conflict now. So what can we do to minimize it, to ameliorate it, to create better conditions for the future? One of the things that we need to be able to do is to focus very heavily on dealing with leaders and identify what are the kind of steps they're going to have to take that would prove they're ready to end the conflict. And if they're not, then we do the practical things that change the realities. Raith will give you chapter and verse of the kind of things on the ground that it makes sense to do.
Right. So the interim approach again, right, Raith? Like small things, baby steps, economic diplomacy things.
Really, first of all, I want to kind of emphasize the point that Dennis said, is that, you know, the practical stuff are always, you know, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is unique, but it's not that unique, in the sense that all of the practical things during negotiations, we made tremendous progress. The problem was with the narrative issues, and I would go a step beyond what Dennis said. I would say that narrative issues are one that you cannot actually negotiate, because at the end of the day, you know, and I've experienced this as a negotiator. I remember one of the most kind of frustrating episodes that I was part of was being asked to negotiate a joint narrative of what happened in 1948. After hours and, you know, liters of coffee and many cigarettes, at the end of the day, we couldn't agree, was 1948 a good year or a bad year? Trying to basically negotiate things that are core to the identities is simply impossible. So, we have to really think of, are there different ways of tackling these issues without expecting any side to give up on their core identities? Which, by the way, as a footnote here, maybe a tangent, I would argue that it is the depth of these narrative issues in the identities of both peoples is one of the reasons why I believe that, you know, no solution but a separation, which is a two-state solution, can ever work. Any idea about a one-state this or a binational that simply will not work, because both nations have such strong sense of identity, rooted in history, rooted in their connection to the landscape, to the land, etc., that simply they cannot coexist. You have to have a degree of separation. Peaceful, yes, but separation. But back to what you're saying. Yes, I do, you know, maybe I wouldn't put it the way that you put it, but As Dennis said, we have to reaffirm commitment to the end game, not in any great detail, but at least to reestablish the idea of a two-state solution. But more important than this, I would argue one of the biggest casualties of the last 2 decades was the idea of cooperation. And again, this is maybe hard to convey to an audience that was not there in the 1990s. At least the three of us remember when Palestinians and Israelis actually experienced, not only us, the negotiators, but your average Palestinian and Israeli experienced that working with the other side produced good things for them. That was one of the reasons why in the 90s, actually, we had such momentum. If you were born come of age since the year 2000, you've only seen the worst that the other side has to give. So these small things that we're talking about are not simply confidence building measures, whether it's economic, whether it is, dealing with the vast array of common challenges, environmental, public health, etc. These are not only confidence building measures, these are measures to rehabilitate the idea of cooperation, that will enable someone like myself to go to my public and say, you know what, look, this is proof that working with the Israelis actually can produce good things for us. And my Israeli counterpart can do the same. Because today, this concept is simply one that does not resonate with anyone of the young generations among Israelis or Palestinians. So these small steps are not simply, an interim step. Today, if you go towards negotiations, we will fail. Neither side has enough leaders who are strong enough, and neither society actually has the basic trust that there is a partner on the other side. We need to tackle this before we go into big negotiations and kind of high diplomacy.
Yeah, I want to, I think somewhere on my wall here, there's a picture of me with Madeleine Albright, maybe going into the new Gaza airport that was for a hot minute was there. And there you had these kinds of hope and things on the ground. There's a question in the chat here, I think from Stuart, about Israeli settlements. And I think we should spend a moment on that, especially given that we've seen increased settler violence in the last couple of days as well. How does that fit into all that we've been talking about today, he asks?
Look, I would say it fits in a number of levels. I mean, again, I want to go back maybe to the 1990s, and we talk about the failure of Oslo. I mean, from the Israeli side, there's a narrative that the Palestinians were never serious, and the proof of that is that the terror continued when we were doing negotiations. From the Palestinian side, settlements were basically proof in the narrative that Israelis were not serious. Look, we're talking and they're gobbling up land. So there is this whole narrative thing around. And this is why the idea of a settlement freeze is so important for Palestinians. So that's kind of one angle. Another angle is, while I personally believe that all settlements are illegal and they're illegally, yet there is a reality that it is today impossible to uproot around 500,000 settlers today we have in the West Bank. And this is what I think the approach that Dennis was talking about, where you have to differentiate between settlements that you can keep. And I would say this, I would not be happy to keep them, but it's a necessity. Yet keep them in a way that's consistent with the two-state solution. And those settlements which are deep in the West Bank, that basically, if you keep them, there's no way that we can have separation between the two peoples. And the third element is the element of violence. And here this is complicated because, as I said, I mean, while I do believe that I am politically opposed to settlements and to settlers. The majority of them are not violent, yet there is definitely a violent group. I would have said a year ago, a marginal violent group. Yet with the current Israeli government and with a couple of, actually a few members of the coalition, whether it's the cabinet or elsewhere, who actually have been giving legitimization to the settler violence, today, it has actually become a real worry and a real threat. Settler violence always existed, but it was marginal. Today, it's a major phenomenon, so major that actually, don't take my word for it. Look at what the head of the Shin Bet, the Israeli counterterror agency, has been saying. If there is one thing that can ignite the West Bank today, it's the settler terrorism. And I think this is one, again, we're not talking about simply individuals doing bad things. We're talking about members of the Israeli cabinet who are giving them top cover and giving them political legitimacy. So this is something that needs to be dealt with both as from a security angle, but also has to be addressed from a political angle.
Dennis, can the U.S. do anything about the support? I mean, you've got a situation right now where the cabinet is divided. Some of the more right-wing members want us to keep diverting money to the settlements away from the war effort. I mean, what can be done here? How do you see this problem?
Well, I think look, I think we have a president who has built enormous political capital and credit within Israel. Biden has shown support from the Israelis from the beginning. He identified emotionally, not just in a policy sense, but emotionally, with the trauma that took place on October 7th. He was the first American president to go to Israel during wartime. So he's built a kind of credit and capability. One of the things that those American presidents who demonstrate to the Israeli public that they get Israel's predicament, they're the presidents who are in a position where they can ask Israeli prime ministers to be responsive, and it's hard for Israeli prime ministers not to be responsive. Those American presidents who don't convey an understanding of the Israeli predicament, they really have very little leverage, because in the end, the prime minister gains by standing up to him. Biden has built that credit. He's built that capital. He has the ability to say things to Bibi. Look, the Israelis may not be going as far as I wanted them to go on humanitarian assistance, but they're doing things that I can tell you doesn't reflect what, in a sense, what the body politic wants. The body politic didn't want any assistance to be going in because he said, why should we be giving any assistance to Palestinians when all these hostages are being taken? If it was up to Bibi, he would not have done this at all. In the end, he rationalized, he said, look, we have to do this because we need the support from the Americans. So yes, I think there are things that we can do. The president has spoken out more than once on the issue of settler violence. I think we can do more. I think we should we should put a spotlight on it and basically say Israel is a country of laws. It cannot tolerate this kind of lawlessness, and it's outrageous. And the idea that these guys will trigger a potential explosion in the West Bank at a time when Israeli soldiers are fighting in Gaza, it's outrageous.
I was looking back at our colleague Martin Indyck's op-ed from 2004. He wrote it when Prime Minister Sharon was floating this whole idea of disengagement unilaterally from Gaza. So almost 20 years ago. And he said, if he doesn't know, one wonders whether President Bush really appreciates what he's getting himself in the United States into. Having trumpeted his support for an independent Palestinian state, he is now taking on responsibility for ensuring that the Gaza mini-state created by Israel's withdrawal does not turn into a failed terrorist state. Is that what's happened here?
Yes, that is exactly what happened here.
So now we have President Biden with all his hugs and embrace for Israel. He's in a real pickle. And one of the questions here now, this is not a political discussion, but we are heading into 2024, and his own advisors are divided on this bear hug for Israel. So how do you see him navigating this, both of you? Go ahead, Dennis, you go first.
All right. Look, I think that he's trying to strike the balance by, on the one hand, being supportive of Israel, but also emphasizing the need for humanitarian assistance, making certain or trying to press pretty hard that Israel carry out its military campaign in a way that really does make every effort to minimize the civilian casualties. He certainly is the one who helped push and produce what are these pauses right now, but he's also standing by them and saying, look, I understand we wouldn't live with this kind of a threat next to us. We can't expect that Israel will live with this kind of a threat next to them. So he's striking a balance. We have the Secretary of State out there again now. We have the director of the CIA in Qatar, along with the head of Mossad, which tells me this is not about a discussion of another day or two extensions. This is probably about a much more significant, maybe another week or two, and a much more significant release of hostages, not just 10 a day, but maybe 50 to 100. So he's taking these steps, and the pauses are designed also to create a circumstance where you lower the temperature. Without changing the objective, you lower the temperature. So I think he's doing, in a sense, the best he can in a circumstance where it's very hard to strike a balance.
Rafe, you want to add on this? And maybe what he faces, I don't know if you want to talk about the politics here of this.
Actually, I don't, because I don't
Yeah.
think, personally, I believe that politics is not everything. Believe it or not, I'm saying this from Washington. There are actually uh, national security objectives. There are foreign policy objectives that actually transcend politics. And I think we are at one of those moments where the administration, I think, quietly looks at it as an incident that can reshape the Middle East. And I think we are trying to insinuate ourselves into it in a way that will help us shape the new outcome that will come out of that. Now, the balance that I see actually, the difficult balance that I see Biden and his national security team having to deal with is not really the political, but it's how do you balance the different interests that we have in the region? And I agree with Dennis, the hug that he gave to the Israelis is key in terms of giving him leverage. I mean, this is what gave Clinton so much leverage back in the 1990s, his ability to empathize. Yet also we have allies in the region, Arab allies, who are starting to feel the heat. I mean, Jordan, I have not been so worried about Jordan since 1980s. Even Abraham Accord countries, if you track their messaging, their diplomatic language from October 8th until now, you see a shift because they are worried about their own public. So how do we, and I think the president will have to demonstrate to some of our allies in Arab allies in the region that his bear hug or his hug, his empathy to Israel is actually producing outcomes that will help also stabilize and meet their own interests. I think at the end of the day, all of the actors, at least, our allies in the region would like to see Hamas out of the picture. Maybe Syria and Algeria would like to have Hamas stay, whatever. But whether it's the Gulf states, whether it is, with the exception of Qatar, by the way, and I have to say this, whether it's Jordan, whether it's Egypt, for them, they see Hamas as a threat. Yet they also see the humanitarian and human situation that's happening there as very destabilizing. So the president has to strike these two, balance these two different sets of issues. But I think so far, in terms of managing the diplomacy of it, I think the administration has been doing a good job.
There's questions here, concern about just the civilian casualties in Gaza as Israel eventually moves into this next phase militarily of, so some questions in the chat about, again, going back to what we said or talked about in the beginning, like how you actually eliminate Hamas, or I guess get rid of those kinds of the military equipment, make it so they can't rule. I mean, you've seen now more than 14,000 people killed reportedly. Sinwar is fine. Hamas obviously is still in control because they're coordinating the release of the hostages and they're able to, the major leaders are still intact. So how much more destruction to achieve that goal? And what happens if they don't achieve it? What happens if they fail?
Look,
Well, that's the worst of all outcomes. Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm no military expert, but I can. Look, I mean, I'm not also a believer that there are no military solutions. I think the ability to basically make Hamas unable to conduct the kind of terror attacks, not only that it did on October 7th, but even deeper than that, is enough to buy you time. I mean, to give you an analogy, today there are many people who still subscribe to the ISIS ideology, and you will never eliminate that ideology. Yet today, ISIS is not a threat. And I think this is the kind of scenario that you want to look at as we talk about Hamas. Now, how do you do it? I don't think it is possible to conduct attacks of the same intensity that we had in northern Gaza. I don't think the diplomatic or the political traffic can bear that. Israel will have to go in a more deliberate and more targeted way, but it will take time. And I think this is, what many have not yet internalized. This is not the 2014 war. This is not the 08-09 war. This is more, if you want to take an analogy, this is closer to what we saw in the second Intifada. Something that will take a long time. It will be
5 years was the second Intifada, right?
Yeah, something like this. I mean, actually, I think more after Defensive Shield when the Israelis actually started. But 2 or 3 years, it cannot be as bloody as it was before. As I said, this is not humanly tolerable, nor is it diplomatic or politically sustainable. Yet it is something that will require a longer period of time. And this is, I think, again, where my sense, again, talking to people, whether in Washington or in the region, that this realization is slowly dawning in, and we're moving into a different way of managing this process.
Wait,
Can I
there's a
just
quick
add,
follow-up.
just-
Yeah, one
can I
second, Dennis, 1 second, please. There's a question here about whether the numbers coming out of Gaza are credible. How do you feel about the numbers?
Oh, it's in the fog of war, there's no way of knowing. All I can say is the following. In the past, the numbers that were coming from the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health basically were in the same ballpark as the numbers coming from the UN and ultimately from the Israelis. So that's one. Two, one of the problems with these numbers is they don't disaggregate who is a combatant and who is not a combatant. So it becomes very hard within this to know what is the actual civilian component. But three, and to my mind, this is most salient, is let's say that the Hamas Minister of Health exaggerates by 30%. We're still having a major humanitarian and human tragedy on our hands. So sometimes I feel we get into this rabbit hole of numbers and kind of lose sight of the fact that this is a human tragedy. One that is maybe justifiable in terms of in legal terms and even national security terms, but to think of it only in terms of number, I think it does not do a service to the kind of human dimension of what is happening there.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I want to just add, I guess, 2 points. One is just to pick up on what Rith just said. It's a catastrophe. Whether their numbers are right or not, it's a catastrophe. We can see it. It's a catastrophe. It's a human catastrophe. And we have a trauma in Israel. We have a catastrophe from their standpoint. We have a catastrophe with the Palestinians. We have an obligation because of this to try to do something about it. Now, the end result, if Hamas is still in power, means it's going to happen again, which means we didn't do anything about it. But we haven't had, Israel in the end is going to find a way to succeed. Janine, when you said, look, they're still in control, they're managing the hostages, there's a complete pause. Some of what was going on, some of the negotiations took more time because there was a real inability to communicate because the Israelis have broken down a lot of the command control. Now you put a pause on this, it allows Hamas, what's there, to begin to communicate again. One of the things they required, which the Israelis, it was part of the deal, no UAVs could be operating because what's happening is the Hamas guys are sort of coming out of the tunnels, they're moving around and so forth. But if you take a look at what's happened in the north, the Israelis may not have completely succeeded yet in the north, but they have destroyed most of the military infrastructure. They have destroyed most of the battalions that existed in the north. They're breaking down the military resistance and wherewithal in the north. They still have to go to the south. But what it suggests, as a military challenge, it's something that can be done. Now, to do it in the south in a way that doesn't impose this terrible human cost requires them to operate differently. And this is what Raith was saying earlier. The nature of the campaign has to be different in the south from what it was in the north.
Okay, they're in the hospital in the south then, right? And the say Sinwar is under the hospital. Okay, so what are you going to do now? What do you do? How does that mean? What does that even to operate differently?
Well, you don't have the same level of aerial bombardment that you had in the north. Look, recall one thing. You had before the Israelis even went in on the ground, they hit the northern part of Gaza very hard for 2 weeks from the air. I'll tell you something that was different. In the 4 previous conflicts, the Israelis had a hierarchy of military targets. And they hit them, but they didn't hit all of them because they said some of these, the civilian consequences of hitting them, the cost is too high, so we won't do it. After October 7th,
Right.
It wasn't just the anger and the rage, it was something else. They said, our objective is to destroy their military capability and their command. That meant the targets they weren't prepared to hit before because of civilian consequences, they now were prepared to hit because they felt if we don't hit them, they will stay in control. That's what's different this time. Now in the South, the setup is going to be different. You're not going to have 2 weeks of bombing from the, basically unlimited bombing that goes on. So it's going to be different than it was. can I say that they won't, you won't see them go into a hospital like they did in Al Shifa Hospital? Even there, they allowed probably a lot of Hamas to leave because they left disguised as those they let evacuate. And Hamas and some look, many of the Hamas you're gonna see them melt into these safe areas as well. Okay, so it's going to be complicated, but Hamas as a military organization can be defeated, and if they're defeated as a military organization, their ability to control Gaza will look very different than it does today.
So I think I know you've already addressed this and we're going to wrap up shortly, but I think there's a question here about the Shibli Telhami, Mark Lynch, Nathan Brown argument from Foreign Affairs that the occupation has gotten to the point where only a one-state solution works. And I think you've both disagreed with this already, but any thoughts on this?
Just to throw some very banal questions about this idea of a one state. What language will this one state have? Is it Hebrew or Arabic? Are they going to take Yom Kippur off, or are they going to take the Eid off?
A lot of days off. You have a lot of days off.
Is the flag going to be blue and white, or is it going to be red, green, and black? I mean, these are banal things, but they are not. At the end of the day, what is the idea of Zionism? The idea of Zionism is that the Jews want to have a state of their own in which they can express their national identity. What is the idea of Palestinian nationalism? The idea of Palestinianism is that we want a state in which we can basically express who we are. Look at our history the way they want to look at our history, more in 1948, etc. You cannot basically ignore it. It's ahistoric. It doesn't understand the depth of the national identities of both peoples to come and say, oh, well, give up your national identities and let's live in a US style kind of state. It doesn't work that way. If you do not give both nations their own states, what you end up with is a civil war. I mean, this one state will be a civil war between the two parties, between the two nations, who's going to define and who's going to dominate, and who is going to be in control of defining the nature and identity of the state. Post-nationalism might be a nice idea to kind of, write books about, but it's not the nature of the way that the Israelis are or the Palestinians are. And I'm afraid that pushing for this is just pushing for the transformation of the conflict, not the resolution of the conflict.
Let me just add one thing. I agree with everything Ray just said. Let me just give you a snapshot of the Middle East. Wherever you have more than one national identity, tribal identity, or sectarian identity, you have a state that is either a failing state, at war with itself, or completely paralyzed. So if you want the Israelis and the Palestinians to look like Libya, to look like Lebanon, to look like Syria, to look like Yemen, that's not a particularly hopeful prospect. And it's certainly not something I think Israelis and Palestinians would want for themselves.
All right, Larry, there's your answer. And I think with that, I'm going to thank Raith and Dennis for joining us for this extremely informative and timely discussion. Thank you to the more than 500 people who joined us and listened in. And I hope amid this time, what I call in my other life, this era of noise where we're just inundated with so much information, that this served to clarify your questions about the conflict. So thank you to Larry Diamond and the Freeman Spogli Institute, and to our sponsors, and to all have a great evening.